Here we are with Rodney in the painting store, and we have 7 or 8 of Rodney's works in the collection, but I thought I'd start perhaps with the most obvious work, and the boy and the river, and ask the question, is Rodney the boy in the picture?
That is me. I grew up near the mouth of the Yarra River in Melbourne, and the river was sort of a big part of our lives really, and I was a paper boy on the Williamstown steam ferry before they built the Westgate Bridge. You can see the bridge in the back, the half-completed bridge in the background there.
Yeah. And
there's the newspaper I'm selling. But at that time I was doing a lot of pictures where I would rework from other pictures, so you got these abstract elements creeping in. And I was really enjoying sort of getting the paint doing lots of things. But the bridge was a very iconic thing in our lives. It was built over a period of many years, so we saw it slowly creeping across the river. There was all sorts of delays, and I actually saw it fall down. I was waiting for the ferry when I was doing a sandwich course at RMIT, and the bridge fell down. And we shot around there and tried to help pull the fence down to get the ambulance in. So it kept intruding on my life, the bridge, as a sort of a symbol of that divide between East and West Melbourne and the classes in a way.
Yeah, and of course Morwell has just had some chimneys come down, which are kind of iconic.
Yes.
and important. So there's kind of an interesting link in that sense.
True, and Hazelwood Power Station is as much an iconic symbol for the valley as this bridge was for the people who lived around the mouth of the Yarra. And the old steam ferry was the only way you could get from west to east Melbourne, unless you drove right around Dynon Road. So it was symbolic in a way of that class barrier in Melbourne between the east and the west.
And class actually becomes an important issue in your work, doesn't it? I mean, if we looked towards some other paintings here, we would see that there are quite ordinary lives being depicted.
That's right. It's always there, yeah.
That's significant?
It is, because growing up I was very aware that there was that divide in Melbourne, and it was in the 60s it was really changing. You know, class barriers were being broken down, and I think that 60s is when working class artists really started appearing in Australia. Didn't really happen before that. And my view when I was a teenager was that I couldn't be an artist because you had to go to university to be an artist, and therefore I sort of remained a worker cartoonist. And eventually when Bob Hawke came in, you know, we had the chance, working class people had the chance to become schooled in fine art, which is a apocalyptic change in Australia, really. Absolutely,
and free education, it made all those things possible that weren't previously possible. And we can see some of those interests in these paintings over here. And here we have, you know, another look at the working class, and perhaps a link to the upper classes, in the sense that this painting's called Cup Day, and Melbourne Cup has become quite an iconic event in our culture. Can you talk a little bit about this work?
I always remembered Cup Day as the first holiday during the year where there was decent weather. It's usually sunny on Cup Day, and it's considered a national disaster when it rains on Cup Day. So you know, I was often out in the backyard sunbaking and listening to the race on the radio and having a beer or whatever. And this is it's set next to a local police station, so even the police are having their Cup Day celebration and their sweep. So yeah, it's that interesting paradox in Melbourne that our main holiday is about the sport of kings, you know, but everybody takes part. It has an egalitarian layer to it as well, that everyone's included. And I've done a series of paintings about public holidays like Boxing Day and Valentine's Day and others, because they provide a really interesting knot to build a story around. You know, the reason we have a public holiday of some kind usually is quite profound, so it's a great excuse for picture making.
You know, we can envisage that, you know, later on the police are going to be much busier than they are here as Cup Day moves on, and
So they're having their pavlova and snags early on in the day.
yes, yeah, and the washing is probably going to stay on the line until the next day as well. And a very kind of old working class style buildings, you know, reminds me of, you know, very much of the sort of the inner Melbourne sort of
All the corrugated iron. And Newport and Williamstown has a fantastic array of architectural styles. You know, it goes all the way from the really from settlement time.
Yeah.
There's old bluestone buildings right up to, you know, 60s modern. But I grew up in a Victorian double-fronted house, and so I've always been in love with Victorian architecture with the iron lace and lots of corrugated iron, and it presents great pictorial opportunities for pattern making and so on too.
Very high-keyed colour in this painting.
Yeah, it's quite celebratory. I was working on doing a few paintings on red grounds then. I think so. When you put the colour in, you kind of have to fight with the red,
yeah.
and it gives the picture a lot of motive force for some reason. And I've returned to doing that now and then because I think it makes you work hard on the picture. You've got to suppress the red somehow.
And we've got some lettering down here that looks like it might be from some form of recycling. Or
yes, people used to repair their back fences with old corrugated iron sheets that they got from somewhere else. And I love that, you know, accidental graffiti thing that happens when people do that. Sometimes you'd only get half of a letter, you know, on the wall.
And possibly after the war, you know, there would be a lot of that sort of material lying around, particularly around a maritime area like
That's
Williamstown
right.
and Newport. So from the high colour and key of Cup Day, we now have a nocturnal scene that's a lot more industrial and maritime. Am I right in saying this might be
It's
Newport?
beside the river, yeah. Yeah, this is Newport, and it's sort of based on our house in Newport, the house I grew up in. And Newport is kind of sandwiched between the river and the railway yards. And there's an aircraft factory on the other side of the river, or there was. So it's in amongst all this industrial ferment, and it made a beautiful place to grow up as a child. You know, you could wander through the railway yards and look for lizards and go down to the river or go to the beach. So it was just a lovely environment to grow up in.
And a solitary tree.
Yes, in those industrial wastelands like the rail yards, there's not a lot of concessions to nature. Yeah. You can see a tiny red dot in the window here. That's my dad lighting his first smoke of the morning.
You know, the picture is very layered and it's got so much potential for stories, and the way that you talk, it's quite personal, it's building layers and layers and layers. Is it important for people to get your story or any story, or they build their own story?
I think the reading of the story is kind of inevitable because of the way that I paint is quite based on storytelling, so I'm not trying to be obscure. But I also think that people attach their own stories to it.
Yes.
You know, if I tell a story of my childhood and grow up, people are bound to think back to their own childhood and how that relates to this. And I don't think that only people with working class backgrounds would get something from this. I think other people would attach their own narrative to it as well. And narrative painting has been my main thing, and I always think of ways to extend the narrative outside the picture. So sometimes, you know, a thing that's here will suggest something else that's going on outside, or the story that I'm telling will, I'm sure, connect to other people's stories in different ways. So I like that fact that the picture moves outside itself.
Yeah, the other aspect of your work is that it's kind of like a board game. You know, we've kind of got ladders here, we've got flattened perspectives, and particularly in Cup Day as well, the perspective's not right. It's kind of so you have the sense of snakes and ladders, and if I go here and fall down, then what am I falling on and where to next? And is that important, do you think, this idea of the flattening of the...
For me, it's important to storytelling, because I find if you use normal perspective, the picture just resolves into a bunch of triangles. And some things have to be very small in the distance, which actually might be quite important. So things attain equal importance in a flattened picture plane. And I was kind of looking at Rajasthani painting and a lot of primitive painting traditions, like Dubuffet, when I was an art student about how to do that and how to get more into the story than a normal perspective would allow you.
It allows you to put a lot of information into the picture.
And to make it equal in some ways.
Yes.
Everything has equal importance.
Which also assists in other people being able to enter the painting and create their own story, because you're not prioritising something that doesn't have any meaning to them. There are plenty of things for them to pull out and say, this is important to me, and build a story from. And
you mentioned map-like views. To me it does operate like a map, because you can move around it in the way that you do in a map. So that aids storytelling too, because you can go for a wander around the map, if you like.
Growing up in a maritime area has been really important for your work. I mean, work that's not in our collection, but researching for this conversation is there are lots of boats, and boats are really important to you. But they're also a vessel for meaning and for storytelling as well. We might move on and have a look at the submarine now.
Good.
Here we have a very large submarine and many stories. And you were telling me before we started that you worked in the Navy for a while, so you actually built on that kind of interest in the maritime as well.
Yeah, when I was young, I used to ride on my bike past the dockyard and see ships in the dry dock, and they were very interesting, rakish looking vessels, and I always wanted to go below on one. And eventually I got a traineeship at the dockyard in electronics, so I got to go into the ships and go on sea trials, so I just loved the job, But in the end I wanted to be an artist, so I eventually shifted careers.
There's a lot of stories that can be pulled out from here, and film references here too. And what was your decision making around the inclusion of the images in this particular painting?
Well, probably a lot of people know the movie Das Boot, about German U-boats during the Second World War, and the small goods hanging down the main passageway of the boat. A very claustrophobic movie, and I wanted to suggest the idea of soundproofing, that they had to run really quiet, so there's all this padding on the walls, and I managed to sneak my favourite colour magenta in doing that. The torpedoes are kind of Art Deco almost, so I was trying to suggest a early 20th century aesthetic in it, as if it's the whole steampunk idea, I guess. Yes. And that it was a sort of a home, and maybe it had superseded its purpose of being a war machine, and it was a survival capsule for an apocalyptic sort of scenario.
Ah, right. And it's got the sort of, it's got a childhood game sort of feel with a control board here, and we've got some sleeping quarters here as part of the home, and we've got a tattooed lady.
Yes.
Here as well.
It's called Uboat with Goat and Giantess. And the giantess is the engineer on the boat, and she's managing all the heavy work up the back. I'm not sure what prompted me to put the giantess in, but I just said sometimes I have these crazy ideas and I just want to do it, So, and it allowed me to put a feminine, because Das Boot is a very male-oriented movie, so it enabled me to put a feminine presence in there.
And the colour is, it's not masculine either.
No, it's quite decorative in a way. So I was sort of playing against that very hard-edged idea of war machinery. I quite like to things to be paradoxical, that they're sort of turning into their opposite, because that somehow creates picture-making opportunities for me.
Yeah, and often in your work the symbols of double meanings. I mean, there's one that I was looking at when I was thinking about talking to you, which is like a fence for botanical gardens, but it's also like a barbed wire fence at the same time. So there's often this sort of duality in some of the things that you're painting.
Yeah. I went to art school in the 80s, so dark painting was very hip in the 80s. Everybody was painting dark apocalyptic imagery, and I had this unstoppable drive to colour. So, Newport was painted in the 80s, but by the time I did this picture, the colour was getting out of control, and it's continued doing so ever since.
Which kind of builds in that idea of childhood too, and games and play through the use of colour. Terrific to have you here today, Rodney. Thanks for coming and sharing a little bit about your life and your work. Thank you
You're
very
welcome.
much.